We left off at the Manishtana. We asked questions, and the questions represent something because there's such a stark contrast in terms of what we do during the night. We have matzah, and we have moror, which is a sign of slavery, represents something not pleasant, not enjoyable. And then we have the dipping. Only a free man dips. You have many opportunities to dip your food in some type of condiment, which makes your food more tasty. And reclining, which at one time, the only person who reclined was a free man. So we have contradictory behavior. We behave like slaves, like a person's at a state of total deprivation, and we behave almost simultaneously like free men, dipping, reclining. So the stark contrast between the two levels of behavior immediately causes one to ask questions. And that's the purpose of this. And as I mentioned yesterday, although we have the Dalit Kosos, we have the 4 cups of wine, we don't ask all year, we don't drink wine. And this night we do drink wine, which seems to be unusual. So I'd mentioned an answer which is given that even a person who's depressed or grieves, wine relieves that state of melancholy, of depression. When a person celebrates, one also drinks. So drinking is not an indication of being a free man or being a slave. I see from Rav Chaim Kanevsky, answers that since a normal Shabbos and Yom Tif, we also drink wine, even if wine would represent celebration, but wine is not something unique to this night. We do every Yom Tif, every Shabbos, we drink wine. Therefore, the drinking of the wine is not something which is so unusual. But matzah and moror, that's unusual. Reclining is unusual. The dipping is unusual. Therefore, these are the questions which are asked. Just thinking, and maybe cited elsewhere, that matzah and chometz, in terms of the spelling. Matzah is mem tzadikei. Chometz has a ches. The only difference, it's the same letters, except between the differences, the ches and the hey. Ches and the hey, as Hebrew letters, are very similar letters. The only difference between the ches and the hey is the ches is closed. You have a roof and you have a right and left leg, and the right and left leg attaches to the roof. The hay, on the right side, the leg attaches to the roof. On the left side, you have a small opening. You have an opening between the left leg and the roof. What's the difference between the two of them? The Gemara tells us that Olam Hazeh, the physical world, was created with the spirituality of the letter Hey. And why the Hey? Because in terms of life, one's choice is wide open. As the space between the two legs, the right and left leg of the hay, if one chooses to be on the very top, you have a right to do that. That's your prerogative. If you choose to go into free fall, even to fall to the lowest level, that's also one's choice. That's the choice given to the human being. However, if one wants to do tshuva, regardless how far he's fallen, he has the ability to come back. How does he come back? He comes back through that opening on the left side. Hashem gives one the opportunity to do tshuva. You come back through the left opening. That's how one comes back. So the Gemara asks, why can't you come back in the same direction in the same opening as you exited. Usually an exit is also an entry point. As you exited from life, you could re-enter life. You abandoned spirituality, you come back through spirituality in the same path. So the Gemara says in two locations, it doesn't work. That once you've already charted that course in that direction and assumed the lifestyle, to change that lifestyle, you must live totally different. You can't have the same set of friends. You can't have the same setting and the same environment and say, despite that, I'll be a tzaddik. I'll do everything right. Because the environment through which the person had violated and transgressed, that environment now is not conducive to spirituality, because in that context, he sinned. So you have to chart a new path. You have to create a new environment, a new setting to be able to do tshuva. Therefore, you have to come through the left side. You can't go back through the same side that you exited. That's the Gemara. So the Ramchal explains, the Ramak, Ramoshe Kurdeviru explains, the Gemara tells us, "B'mokim shebali tshuva omdim, ain't tzadikim gemur omdim." Where the Baal Tshuva stands, even a person who's a tzaddik, afil tzadikim gemurim, absolute tzaddik, does not stand at that same level. So he explains, what does this mean? So he explains, although we read in Pirkei Avos, Aseh Siog LeTorah, that a person has to make fences for the Torah, because since we are inclined to many blind spots and oversights, we have to make fences for ourselves. Aseh Siog LeTorah. But what happens, despite all the fences, the person totally abandoned his Masorah, his tradition, his Yiddishkeit. Now he wants to come back. Because he himself is already conditioned to violate, what level of fence does he need? I always give the example. You travel on the highway, and sometimes you have a guardrail. Very often you have no guardrail. So if you travel, sometimes you see the guardrail, it's a vertical post, and they're like cables, 3 cables run horizontally attached to every one of the guardrails, the vertical posts. So if a car goes out of control, those metal cables are able to withstand the impact and hold the car from going off the mountain. But if you had a Mack truck riding that road, and that Mack truck should go veer and go into those cables, it tears right through the cables and goes off the mountain. An ordinary person, nobody's perfect. We vacillate. We do the right, we do the wrong. But basically, we're committed to do the right thing. So therefore, an ordinary fence would be enough. What about if the person was a repeated offender? And he really has to do sivri tshuva. He has to change his whole lifestyle. An ordinary fence is not going to help this person. It's not sufficient to hold him back from temptation, because he's so conditioned in the negative, he's not going to be able to be held back. Therefore, he needs very serious fences. Normally, you have to distance yourself 1,000 feet. This person has to distance himself miles away. It's like lahavdil. Person is an alcoholic. If he's exposed to if he's in a room where people are drinking, he can't deal with it. He can't even expose himself even to see the bottle of liquor or whiskey, because immediately he'd be attracted. An ordinary person doesn't have a drinking problem, although he knows that if you drink more than he should, it'll affect his clarity and his stability. He's able to control himself, but the alcoholic can't control himself. So you have to resort to extreme levels of distance to be safe, not to drink from the whiskey or the alcohol, the liquor, which will negatively impact his life identically. So the Ramak writes in the Torah Dvorah that when the Baal Tshuva comes back, he has to come back, he has to be very close to the top. An ordinary person, you could be at the edge and you make a slight fence, you're not going beyond that point. You want to take a peek. You can take a peek and it's within your eye range. The person who's the one who violated and transgressed endlessly, he can't get too close even to peek. Because if he peeks, he's going to be drawn right over the edge. Therefore, when he comes back, he has to come back at the very top. He has to push his belly against the top when he comes through to that left side. That's the level of fence he has to take. And that's why it says, "B'mokim shebali tshuva omdim," the location where the Baal Tshuva has to put himself at the very top, not even go near the edge. Tzaddikim, they can't stand there. It doesn't mean to say that they're so much greater. It means the level of what they have to resort to be able to control their lives, to do the right things. Now, what's the hay? Matzah represents what? Matzah represents control, as we said. It doesn't rise. It's humility. It's not tasty. It's bland. It's something which doesn't represent temptation. You're in a position that's hay, but it represents all the year we eat chometz. Chometz rises, that's arrogance. That's self-centeredness. Chometz ferments, it's tasty. We have to wean ourselves from that. For 7 days, we remove ourselves from chometz. And what do? We have matzah. During the year, it's ches. There's no coming back. We just keep going in the direction. We go to the edge. Pesach, we have matzah. During the year, we have chametz, we have matzah. We go back and forth. On Pesach, there's only matzah. There's only the hay, which represents tshuva, and you understand that the only way to go is through that side entry point and stick to the top, and only then are we able to maintain ourselves as controlled people, and that is the tzaddik. Both. Halayla zer, it's kula matzah. The Ramchal, in one location, writes that the night of the 15th, when we ate the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, sequestered in our homes, when Hashem had skipped over the homes of the Jews, and he had seen the blood of the Paschal lamb on the lintel and on the doorpost, and he killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, and in addition, being sequestered in homes, doing the mitzvah, we were protected from the Malach HaMovis, as it says, Lo yitin hamashchis, God will not allow the destroyer to destroy you. This was the most extreme level of midas hadin, the attribute of justice, but because we were in our homes doing the mitzvah of Pesach, Hashem protected us. There's a famous word from the Siforno that the Bechorim initially was supposed to be the Kohanim. It was supposed to be the officiants in the Mishkan, the Beis HaMikdash. Due to the chet of the Egel, that they were involved in idolatry together with the rest of the Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, they became disqualified because they became tainted with idolatry. The only tribe, Shevet, that was not involved was Shevet Levi. Therefore, they are what? So the highest level of Levi is what? Are the Kohanim. That's Aaron Ubanov. And the other Leviim, they assist the Kohanim in their service in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. But why was the Bechor initially naturally holy? So the Torah tells us, because when I took the Bechor for myself, when I smote the Egyptians, what was that all about? So the Sephardo explains that the Bechor, even the Jew, was liable. Why did God choose the Bechor, the firstborn, of the head of the household? Because they are the most responsible. They are the oldest in the families. And there's even a question in the Midrash that even women, if there was no male firstborn or the oldest, the women, the eldest woman in the family, she was taken because she's the most responsible. So that was the Midas Adin says, so the Jews themselves being a Memtesh Sharei Tuma with a 49th level of impurity, the Bechor should be taken. The Jews should be taken as the Egyptian is being taken. However, what did God do? By consecrating the Bechor, God says, I'm taking the Bechor for myself. Automatically, the Bechor himself being consecrated is in God's camp. Being in God's camp, that is not in any way available or within the reach of the Midas Adin. Give you an example. The equivalent, the law is that if you have a city, the Torah tells us, it's called Ir Nidachas, which the majority of the city become idolaters. So the Torah tells us that you kill all the idolaters of the city, and all the possessions of the city have to be burnt. Even the possessions of those who are not idolaters, because the city itself is called a condemned city. Because the city, the majority of the city was involved in idolatry. So you destroy all the possessions, even the possessions of the non-idolaters. So the non-idolaters are sent off to a safe location, but whatever was theirs is burnt. Because it assumes a level of contamination, spiritual contamination. What about if you have animals, everything has to be killed. What about if you have korbanos? You have animals that were consecrated. What about if you had a pair of tefillin? You had a mezuzah. Do you burn that? Because Torah says everything when the city has to build has to be burnt. So the Gemara tells, it says, ushlolo. Its spoils you should burn. It spoils, but not shlal shamayim. But the spoils which have relevance to God, that you don't burn. That's not part of the city, because that's God's domain. The Bechor was taken into Hashem's domain, and being God's domain, it's not subject to the Midas Adin. Because at that point, being at the lowest level, at the brink of extinction, the Memte Sharei Tuma, even the Bechor should have. The Jewish Bechor, firstborn, as the Egyptians were killed, he should have also, but because God consecrated them, they entered into his domain, they were under his protection, therefore they were not. Therefore they were not killed the night of the Bacchus Bechoros, the 15th night of Nisan, for that reason. However, because of what happened at Sinai, that all the Jews were involved in the Egel, which was idolatry, they became disqualified, but they still retain a degree of Kedusha. Why? Because we still have Pidyon Aben. We have the redemption of the firstborn. They have to be redeemed. So you see, they have some degree of Kedusha. When the Kohen duchens, we have Nesis Kapayim, who washes the hands of the Kohen? The Levi. But if there's no Levi to wash the hands of the Kohen, who washes the hands of the Kohen? The Bechor. The Bechor, if there is no Bechor, there is no firstborn. Who washes the hands of the Kohen? The Kohen washes his own hands. It's not an ordinary Jew wash, or even regardless how great he is as a Talmud Chacham, the order is the Levi washes the hand of the Kohen. If there's no Levi, it's the Bechor. If there's no Bechor, the Kohen washes his own hands. Because the Bechor himself has an innate Kedusha, although he was disqualified from being the Kohen, but nevertheless, being the firstborn, he retains that special status, and therefore he's the only one who's qualified, other than Levi, to ritualize the hands of the Kohen before Birchas Kohanim, for that reason. So these are the questions which are presented at the Seder, the 4 questions. And this is the opening of Higanto Levincho. So the head of the household now responds to these questions. The stark contrast, here we behave like slaves, being in a state of total deprivation, and simultaneously we act in a state of a free man, dipping, reclining. How do we reconcile this seemingly, it's like schizophrenic behavior? Are we A or are we B? What are we? Are you Mr. Jekyll or are you Mr. Hyde? Who are you? I'm not sure in Israel if they have Mr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. Maybe they have somebody worse there, I'm not sure. The contrast. So the Gemara tells over a story, and before the story, so we respond. Avodim hoyinu lefara b'mitzroyim. we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. We find when Moshe shares with his father Yisro all what happened in Egypt and how Hashem had taken us out, it says, Vayishma Yisro. Yishma, what did Yisro hear? What did he hear that he was so moved and touched that impacted him that he left the glory of Midian, being a statesman, to go into the desert? So he heard about what Paro and Egypt had done to the Jewish people and what Hashem had done to them. Melech kosher, am kosher. He was a very difficult king, overburdening king, and the people were very difficult people. Avodo Pharaoh, we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. Now, it's interesting. The Balatura makes it a point. A Jew, if he chooses to sell himself into slavery, he's a slave for 6 years. It's called an Eved Ivri. He's a Hebrew slave. If he steals and he's not able to repay the one who he victimizes for the theft, if his value and the value of the theft is the same value, he's sold into slavery, and the money which he sold for, that money he pays the person who he victimized. That's Eved Ivri. Now, what happens if the slave chooses? So we said after 6 years, Torah says 6 years he works for his master. The 7th year he's freed. He goes lachavshi chinam. After 6 years he goes out free. What happens? He chooses to go beyond 6 years, and he says, "Ohafti es Adoni, es ishti uvonai, es bonai." I love my master. I love my wife. Because the master is permitted to give him a Canaanite woman to have children from her. And I love my children. Now, hear what goes on over here. There's a famous word from Rabbeinu Bachya. Pre-Sinai, how were the Jews referred to? What was our classification? We were called Ivrim. Ivrim. We refer to Elokehu Ivrim, Shlachani Aleichem, the God of the Hebrews. Post-Sinai, we were called Yisraelim. When we became the Am Hashem, we were Yisraelim. We've been Yisrael. Yet when we speak about the slave, he's not called Eved Yisraeli, he's called Eved Ivri. The question is why? What happens if he says, Ohafti es ishti, Adoni es ishti bonai? After 6 years, he's ready to be released, and he goes to the Bezdin, he says, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children. It says, they take it all, put it through his right ear, and avodu l'olam. He continues that state of slavery until Yovel, till the Jubilee year, and then he's released. So Rabbeinu Bachya explains, he says, I love my master. But firstly, why do we choose the heir? So the Gemara tells us in Kedushin, Ma ozen sheshama b'Sinai. The ear that heard in Sinai, avodayhem. When he took us in Sinai, you are my subjects. V'lo avodim la'avodim. You're not a subject of a subject. So how do you forget what happened at Sinai? Ozen shesham b'Sinai. If you heard at Sinai who you are, that you ultimate in royalty, how do you sell yourself to another mortal? You're the subject of the king. Therefore, evidently, you didn't process it well. You didn't internalize it sufficiently to understand that it should resonate, that this is something unacceptable. So therefore, there's a defect in your hearing processing. Therefore, we put the whole through the ear. The ear that heard in Sinai, you should not steal. And now he goes and he steals to indicate that there's some kind of defect in the ear, in the hearing processing, So we put the hole through the ear. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, evidently, if he would understand that he's a post-Sinai Jew, he's a post-Sinai Jew, not a pre-Sinai Jew, he wouldn't have stolen, and he would have never sold himself into slavery, because he would have appreciated the event that took place at Sinai, and what was transmitted at Sinai. But because he did not, he doesn't recall or appreciate what post-Sinai is. So who is this person? He's still Ivri. This person lives his life like a pre-Sinai Jew. What were we pre-Sinai? We were Ivrim. Therefore, the slave is called Eved Ivri. He's an Eved Ivri. He's the pre-Sinai Jew. He's not the post-Sinai Jew. Because if he understood what the post-Sinai Jew was, that we are Yisrael, he would have never stolen, and he would have never sold himself into slavery. So the Baal HaTorah makes a point that, and therefore, as a result, it's finished with Rabbeinu Bachya, halachically, this woman is not his wife. She's a Canaanite woman. The children are not, there's no pedigree. The children are not his children. But yet the man says, after 6 years, After is Adoni, I love my master. What do you mean you love your master? God's your master. You have no relevance to a mortal master. I love my wife, but she's not your wife. She's a Canaanite woman. If you marry this woman normally, there's no kedushin. She's not your wife. As Bonai, I love my children, but they're not your children. They're biological children. Halachically, not your children. The person has been so deluded through this experience, he doesn't see the forest from the trees here. He believes this is his wife, these are his children. Therefore, he's still holding by the Ivri, he's not Yisraeli. Therefore, he's evident that this is Rabbeinu Bachya. So Baal HaTorah makes a point. This is a beautiful point he points out. When we were in Egypt, whose slaves were we? Were we the slaves of the commoner? Weren't the slaves of the commoner. We were Paro, the Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Paro in Egypt. So the question is, what are we slaves to Paro? We were the slaves of all the mortals, of all the subjects of Pharaoh. What if we were slaves to Paro in Egypt? So it's very interesting. You know, Yosef, his responsibility was to prepare the Jews for the bondage, and ultimately, after the years where we're going to be there, we should be able to leave and be in a position to be able to go to Sinai. That we shouldn't assimilate and go into the oblivion. Now, if you read the story of the famine, the 7 years of famine, it says it was so bad that all the years of plenty were forgotten as if they never existed. And that was the symbol of the fat cows being swallowed by the emaciated cows, and it wasn't even noticeable that they were swallowed up. Now, so if you read how things went over the few years, first they purchased wheat, they purchased grain. Then when they depleted all their ability to purchase, they sold their livestock. And then they sold their fields, their property. Then they sold their bodies. They became the chattels of Paro. Yosef purchased everything. He took all their money for the government, for Paro. He took their livestock. He took their land. He took their bodies. And then what did he do? He said, I'm a benevolent monarch. The grain that you harvest, you will take the majority, and only a percentage goes to the king. The land is the king, and you people are the slaves of the king. You are the subjects of the king, not just subject, you are the slaves. The Egyptian people became the chattels of the king. So when the Jews were slaves for the Egyptians, whose slaves were they? They were the slaves of Paro. Because we have the concept is the slave is what belongs to the master. Any acquisition which a slave makes immediately is transferred to the master. We say, Mashkona Evid Kona Rabo. What the slave acquires, it's the equivalent the master acquires. So we were slaves in Egypt. We were slaves of a commoner, or we were the slaves of royalty. We were never slaves of commoners. The shift was, the transition was king to king, lahavdil. The mortal king to the divine king, to the king of kings. We were melech. We were avdei melech. We were the slaves of a king. Avodim hayinu. So therefore, so when a Jew sells himself to an immortal, the Jews were never, even when we were slaves to Paro, it was not just to an ordinary person. Paro was the monarch, was the height of civilization. Hashem took us out to be his subjects. So if a Jew understands what God did, there was never a time in our history we were slaves of mortals. Because even when the slave of the mortal, a mortal was the highest echelon of human being, power-wise. So therefore, it was not a disgrace as a human being to be the slave of the king, but to be a slave of a commoner, that's a disgrace. And especially if Hashem took you to be his subjects, how do you sell yourself even to a commoner? Even a mortal king would be a disgrace. Therefore, you're Eved Ivri. Who were we slaves to? To Paro in Egypt. Although we were served the commoners, it was the will of Paro that we should attend to the dictates of his subjects. It's like the king has an echelon, an inner infrastructure in the government, but every government employee is under the control of the king. Same idea. Yitzhak Hashem Elokeinu. And Hashem Elokeinu is interesting. It should say Yitzhak Hashem. Hashem is master. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, infinite. What's Elokeinu? Hashem Elokeinu took us out of Egypt. But seemingly he became Elokeinu at Sinai. Lios Lachem Elokim, we say. He took us out of Egypt that he should be our God. But it was saying, who took us out of Egypt? Hashem Elokeinu. We're speaking about now that we are the chosen people, looking back, Hashem Elokeinu took us out. That's one. Or even then, it already was Elokeinu. When Hashem sent Moshe Rabbeinu to communicate to Paro, let my people go. How did he refer to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people? B'ni B'chori Yisrael. Even in Egypt, we already refer to as B'ni B'chori Yisrael. You have my son, my firstborn Yisrael. That's who you're enslaving. So Hashem already, as he expressed it then, through Moshe being his agent, Hashem says, we are his people. So by already establishing a relationship, even in Egypt, pre-Sinai, so who took us out of Egypt? Hashem Elokeinu. That intimate value, relationship between Hashem and us was already present even in Egypt, even pre-Sinai. So we speak about Avodim Hayinu L'Far B'Mitzrayim. V'Yotzeinu Hashem Elokeinu B'Sham. Hashem himself took us out of there. How? B'Yod Chazokah. Rashi cites the Midrash. In the history of existence, there was never a time where Hashem displayed his might so publicly, almost irrefutably, that this is God doing. Changing nature, bringing about levels of miracle which were never seen by humanity ever before. Even by angels. On the terrestrial level, God never did things which were contrary to the natural order. We have Esamakos, we had 10 plagues. Those 10 plagues was Yod Chazokos Ro Netuyo. First of all, who took us out? Hashem Elokeinu. And how did he take us out? Yod Chazokos Ro Netuyo. Anything less than that, it wouldn't have happened. Now, why was that necessary? It mentioned, it's based on a Pirkei Reb Lezer, Rashi and Pirkei Avos. when he speaks about the 10 Asar Nisyonos, the 10 tests which Hashem had tested Avraham Avinu, Asar Maimoros Nivra Olam, all the 10s. So it says, so over there Rashi says that why does everything manifest itself in 10? We have the 10 utterances of Hashem brought about existence, the 10 challenges, tests of Avraham Avinu, Eser Makos, Aser Sadibros, everything is 10. Why is it 10? Why is that the number? A minyan is 10, which is a microcosm of Klal Yisrael. It's 10. 10 always repeats itself. So he explains what was the objective of creation. Why does Hashem create this seemingly world which borders on the infinite? So it's the first words of the Torah tells you why God created this existence. Bereshis bara Elokim. Bishvil Bereshis, for the sake of Bereshis, Hashem created Shamayim v'Oretz. It's a Shamayim v'Oretz. What's Bereshis? Bishvil Torah shenikras Bereshis. For the sake of Torah, which is called the chosen, the choicest. Bishvil Yisrael shenikras Bereshis. For the sake of the Jewish people. So the world which was created, the objective is what? The profile has to accommodate Torah, has to accommodate the Jewish people. Now, what is Torah? Torah, in its total encapsulation, is 10. That's Aseres HaDibros. The 10 Aseres HaDibros at Sinai, that is the Torah in its totality. That is the objective of creation. So that Asor Maimoros, the 10 utterances were uttered. Why it was 10? Because ultimately, the world which has to come about is the setting for the 10, for the Aseres HaDibros. Those are the challenges, and only through those challenges within the Aseres HaDibros are we able to address and perfect the objective of our spirituality, which is our neshama, through those challenges. That's Aseres HaDibros. To be able to bring that about, Sinai, because of what we experienced in Egypt, Hashem took us, we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. The only way we could be extricated from there was only with Yod Chazak Zor Netuyo. Now, what that Yod Chazak Zor Netuyo, how did it manifest itself? 10 Makos. That was the Yod Chazak Zor Netuyo, because that had to prepare us and put us in a position that we should be able to stand at Sinai and say Nasiv Nishma and be qualified to receive the Aseres HaDibros. So there were 10 to put us in a position to mentor us, to be qualified, have a capacity, to be worthy, and a level to be say Nasiv Nishma to accept the Aseres HaDibros. So that's 10. So the objective of creation was achieved through Avraham Avinu first being the founding patriarch of Klal Yisrael, which Asar Nisyonos, the 10 challenges, tests of Avraham Avinu, and then we have the Yod Chazak Zor Netuyo, which is 10 again, and the objective of all this is Aseres HaDibros, is the 10 commandments, the 10 dictates which were communicated at Sinai. The Maral of Prague points out that based on a pasuk in Yechezkel refers to the Egyptian people as Besar Chamorim Besarom, that the Egyptian people, the equivalent, their flesh is like the flesh of donkeys. Besar Chamorim Besarom. So the Maral of Prague asks, firstly, Egypt was the height of civilization. They were the most advanced. They weren't donkeys. You have a chamor. Like in Israel, they say, they don't use those words. They use, unfortunately, other languages. But one time, like the most insulting comment you can make is chamor. You're a chamor, you're a donkey. Where are your brains? It's like the most unintelligent animals, beast of burden, chamor. So if the Egyptians were so sophisticated, so advanced, why does Yechezkel Navi identify them, depict them as Besor Chamor and Besorim? So Moral of Prague explains in the Gurus Hashem that the word Chamor, the root of the word is Chomer. Chomer means material. So he explains of all the 70 nations, the root nations of existence, the nation which was the most devoid of spirituality were the Egyptians. They were the most physical, had the most mundane. They had the least relevance to Kedusha, to spirituality. Therefore, of all of them, they are Chamorim. They have the greatest relevance to Chomer, to material. Therefore, they're referred to as Besar. Their flesh is like the flesh of donkeys. It's Chomer. There's very little, he says, and therefore, we find in Egypt, because they had the least relevance to Kedusha, to spirituality, we find witchcraft, we find all the lowest, all the perversions, sexual perversions, idolatry, bestiality, everything was Egypt. That's Tovas Mitzrayim, as the Torah speaks about the abominations of Egypt. Why it's the abominations of Egypt? Because Egypt being so devoid of spirituality, therefore, the result of that was that level of behavior, because that's what they were involved in, because they had no capacity. So what was our environment that Hashem chose us to be in? An environment that was devoid of spirituality, of Kedusha, no relevance for 210 years. And that was part of, we find that Parshas Vayechi is Parshas Stuma. It's a sealed portion. Why is it a sealed portion? Nistabu libam v'einem shel shem ne'ashibud. When Yaakov passed away, our hearts and our eyes became shut down because of the bondage. But as long as Yosef and that generation was alive, the physical bondage did not start. But the answer is, on a subliminal level, being in that environment, it's like the person doesn't even realize that we're continuously bombarded with certain energies, certain magnetic fields, which continuously wear away on our immune systems. And eventually, it compromises us totally. When Yaakov passed away, as long as Yaakov was alive, he deflected all this. All the impurity that we were engulfed with had no relevance to us. He was able to deflect it. We were in the spiritual cocoon. The moment Yaakov passed away, that spiritual cocoon didn't exist anymore. Although we didn't necessarily sense it, factually, the process of minimizing us and causing this gradual regression of Kedusha began. That's Nistabu Einam V'Libim Shel Shem Ne'ashibud. The eyes and the hearts of the Jews were shut down. That's what's Pasha Stuma. I mentioned, at the end of time, there's a discussion which we discussed in the Haggadah. At the end of time, are we still going to mention Yitzis Mitzrayim, the miracles of Egypt? Because factually speaking, nobody disagrees that when Mashiach will come, the miracles that we're going to see, the miracles of Egypt are going to pale to those miracles. So if that's the point, what's the point? And the Gemara in Brochus explains it with an allegory. A person goes and he's traveling and he's attacked by a snake. And he kills the snake. Miraculously, he's able to kill the snake, this python. And so when he meets people, he tells them over what he experienced, the miracle. He was attacked by this python, he killed the snake. Travels a little further, he's attacked by a bear. And he kills this Kodiak bear, this pole, whatever the bear is. Does he tell people about the snake? He speaks about the miracle of the bear. The miracle is much greater. You don't talk about the snake any longer. Goes further, all of a sudden he's attacked by a lion. And he kills the lion. You talk about the bear or the snake, you talk about the lion. Because the miracle is much greater. When Mashiach comes, the miracles are going to be at a level that the miracles of Mitzrayim are going to pale. and that can be considered relatively like ordinary. So after Mashiach, do we still speak about Hashem who took us out of Egypt, or Hashem who performed the miracles at the time of Mashiach? Because the miracles of Egypt become ordinary. As they say, it's nothing to be impressed with, comparatively speaking. We rule halacha, it says, Kol Yemei Chayecha. What's Kol Yemei Chayecha, we discuss is the Agora. Not only Olam Hazeh, even Olam Habo, even at the end of time, we're still going to discuss Yitzis Mitzrayim. Because what was the basis to be able to merit a Mashiach? Why was there a Kabbalah Torah? It was only because of the miracles of Egypt. Because of what we saw in Egypt, and we were weaned from all the years of impurity of Egypt, and that was the purpose, the objective, that the 10 miracles to prepare us for the Aseret HaDibros. Therefore, those miracles were essential, crucial. Otherwise, we would never merit Mashiach, because we would have never been taken as the chosen people to be worthy of the Kabbalah Torah for that reason. So therefore, Hashem Misham, he took us out of there, that location, the location that was the abomination, the abominated location of the world. Nothing less than Yad Chazak Zor Netuya. V'ilo lo hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avosei Mitzrayim. And if Hashem wouldn't have taken us out, our forefathers from Egypt, Harei Onu V'Oneinu V'nei V'Oneinu B'Shubadim Ha'inu L'Far B'Mitzrayim. We, our children, our grandchildren, we'd still be enslaved to Paro in Egypt. So there's a famous question which is discussed. I mean, most civilizations which existed in the past went into the dustbins of history. They didn't exist. Here we're talking about nearly 4,000 years later, 3,800 years later. So if Hashem wouldn't take us out of Egypt, we'd still be slaves to Paro in Egypt. There's no civilization that lasted that long. They eventually disappeared. No, but we'd still be slaves to Paro in Egypt. What does that mean? What it means that the impact, the level of spiritual trauma and deterioration that would have remained with us forever. We had to be cleansed and purged and detoxed of those spiritual impurities, which became embedded in our neshamos in Egypt. Even Paro is something of the past. Egypt doesn't exist any longer. But the effect, what they actually had embedded in us, it became not possible to extract. That's how deeply intertwined and meshed that impurity became in our neshamas. The only one who could bring about that detoxification of all that impurity is only God himself, which came through Yad Chazak Zur Netuya. And if Hashem wouldn't have taken us out of Egypt, we'd still have the effects of that impurity. We read in Pirkei Avos, Ein lecha ben choreh el mi she'osek b'Torah, el mi she'osek b'Talmud Torah, because we find by the Luchos, the Mishnah quotes the pasuk. It says choras al Luchos, that the words of the 10 Commandments were etched, were engraved on the tablets. The words choros and cherus are the same letters. Atikra choros el cherus. Ein lecha ben chorin el mi she'osek b'Talmud Torah. The only free man is the person who engages in the study of Torah. I mean, the only thing that's able to remove the shackles of the Yetzer Hara. You know, we say people, they're slaves of the desires. They're slaves, literally slaves. That influence, those experiences, the impurity which we absorbed in Egypt, we'd have all those spiritual impurities. We'd be slaves of those impurities. It's like, God forbid, a person has a genetic disease. If it's part of the genetics, you can't escape it. It's inevitable. The person, it's going to repeat itself because it's part of the gene profile. This became our spiritual genetic profile. It had to be altered. That had to be corrected. The only one who was able to correct that was Hashem through the Yod Chazak Zor and the Tuya. Being exposed to his level of Kedusha, of the miracles, and we were purged and detoxed, but otherwise we'd still be the victims of those experiences of the past. So we're not speaking about Paro, the monarch, or Egypt, the people, or the location. We'd still be carrying all those impurities till the end of time, until we go to the grave, God forbid. As advanced as we may be in Torah, elders, every echelon of advancement, we know the Torah. Mitzvah is still a mitzvah. Why? You know, it's interesting. Aristotle, Rabbi Chana Wasserman, he has a work, it's called Kovitz Memorim. It's compilation of various lectures which he had given. So he asked a question. He says, Rambam, when he speaks about Aristotle, he's known as Aristo. He speaks about his level of genius was at a level that he was able to fathom and comprehend things, concepts, which a Navi only was able to know because God communicated to him. That was the genius of Aristotle. And he asked a very basic question. Aristotle being the genius of geniuses, that we can't even relate to his genius, even though it has no relevance to Shlomo Melch's genius. He didn't believe in God. And yet the Torah tells us that when a girl becomes 12 years old and a boy becomes 13 years old, one of his obligations, he has to believe in God. How's it possible? The genius of geniuses doesn't believe in God. That's how difficult it is. So how does Hashem put this responsibility and this burden that despite everything, the child must have enough level of clarity to believe in God? That's Rabbi Chanan's question. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Right? That's the question he asks. So what he answers is this. We're all subject to desire. When a person has desire, we have conflicts of interest. Aristotle, because of his level of desire, through his unlimited genius, relatively speaking, he justified every act to accommodate and facilitate his desire. An innocent child of 12, 13 years old, they don't have that baggage, those desires. So on a simple level, you see something, you see it. The person has conflicts of interest. The person, because it deludes himself and doesn't see, as we said before, the forest from the trees. Therefore, it's only because of the desires you're not able to come upon truth. But if you don't have all that interference, it's not complicated to come upon truth. Now, Barasi Yitzhar Barasi Torah Tavli. Hashem says, I've created an evil inclination, which as the Mesilas Yesharim writes, the evil is uncontentable. You can't deal with it. He can outwit us, outsmart us endless times over. But Barasi Yitzhar Barasi Lo Torah Tavli. But I create specifically the Torah as an antidote. You incapacitate him. You break those shackles. It neutralizes him, that he doesn't have an effect on you when you engage in Torah study. So as a result of that, Aristotle, if he didn't have Torah, didn't have that, has no relevance to his neshama. So when Aristotle is shackled with all those impurities, he uses his genius to justify every one of those depraved levels of behavior which he had. There's a famous story where Aristotle, they once caught him committing adultery. So he said to Aristotle, how do you behave this way? He says, at that moment, I wasn't Aristotle, but I committed adultery. You understand? His desires overtook him to such a degree. At that moment, I wasn't Aristotle. I was who I wanted to be. That's what it means. Due to one's conflicts of interest, you could turn day into night, and you could turn summer into winter. Whatever you want to turn it into, the human being has that ability. But we have the Torah. So afilu kolonu chacham kolonu v'om zakenim kolonu yom mitzvah. We still have to tell over the story of Tzipis Mitzrayim, because if he wouldn't have taken us out of there and appreciate what that was, we would have never come to Sinai. We only had relevance to Sinai because of the process of the detoxification. They had the capacity to etch up and move up level after level until we reached our pinnacle of spirituality, was the Memte Sharetara, which was after the 50th day, were we worthy to be taken as the Am Hashem. Hopefully this foundation would launch us into the mitzvah of Vigatel V'Incha to be able to fulfill the mitzvah properly tonight, Mitzvah Hashem of Vigatel V'Incha. Okay, everybody should have a good Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom. We should have a good Yom Tiv, Chag Kosher V'Sameach, and we should utilize the day. And I just want to conclude that the Ramchal and the Maral both say that according to Torah, when we have dates on the calendar, they're not just purely commemorative, but rather all the various energies that were released and unleashed on that day of the year when originally they happened, it repeats itself, and we could be beneficiaries of those energies. So what is Tezvav, the 15th? It was Leil Shimurim. It was the day that we left Egypt. Those same forces Hashem released and unleashed to bring that about, tonight, those same forces exist. And if we engage in the Vigatel V'Incha, we speak about the bondage, the redemption, and call Amar Ba'areza Meshubach. The more you engage, the more you're a beneficiary of that. You're a beneficiary of those forces. So therefore the opportunity, and this allows us to have a capacity throughout the year due to tonight that we wouldn't have unless we engage in it as we should. I'm going to end here.